Hello and welcome to our webinar today, which is brought to you by the Orientation to Ontario program in affiliation with the Refugee Assistance Program. Today's topic is domestic violence, part one of two. But before we get on to the topic itself, I just wanted to highlight to you that the Orientation to Ontario program provides information and support to help refugees who are settling in Ontario. And it does this by offering workshops, webinars like this one today, and many other resources that are both in print and online. Orientation to Ontario, otherwise known as O2O, is managed by cont'd Immigrant Services, and it is funded by the Government of Ontario. So let's look at our topic. In Canada, as it is in all countries in the world, family is a very important part of our society. And there are many ways to be a family here in Canada. It has many meanings. It includes, of course, parents and children, but it can also refer to grandparents and uncles and aunts and any large group of people that are related by blood and by marriage. So the basic definition of any family group are people that love and support each other, who are connected through blood and or marriage. So here's our agenda. You can see it highlighted in mauve there in purple, part one. We're going to talk about domestic violence and what it means, the different kinds that exist. We're going to talk a little bit about the abuse against women specifically, and family members or intimate partners. We're also going to talk about elder abuse. Our grandparents, our elder uncles, our elder aunts. In all cases of domestic violence, there are serious consequences, and we're going to highlight what those consequences are. And then we're also going to talk about where and how to get help. Now, you will see there in part two, this is a separate webinar altogether, and this is where we focus on child abuse. So let's begin with our definition. Domestic violence includes any physical violence or behavior that one member of the family uses against another member in order to gain control. It could involve a physical act, but it could also be threats or intimidation or isolation and other kinds of behaviors that are used to maintain fear in the family so that the abuser feels power over the others. Domestic violence includes all kinds of violence that can occur in the home. However, many people, when they are using this term, domestic violence, they are referring to spousal abuse or intimate partner violence, and that means, violence between a couple. But violence can also happen between other members of the family. Domestic violence is about having power over other family members. This can include the children, this can include grandparents. Any member of the family can use violence to control the other family members. Here are the different types. We are going to go into these in a little bit more detail, and I'll give you some examples a little bit later on, but I just wanted to list them here for you. As you can see, physical, that's probably the most common one that people know about. Sexual, psychological, and this includes emotional abuse or verbal abuse, and financial. Now, not all these types of behavior are against the law, but they can still have very dangerous results, dangerous consequences. We're going to go into these types a little bit further on. When any type of violence occurs between family members or intimate partners, so they don't have to be necessarily married, but people who are living together, this is called domestic violence. So family relationships are very close, and that makes violence between family members more complicated than other types of violence that can happen perhaps in the community. And this can be especially dangerous because of family dynamics. It's very common for the victims of domestic violence to love the person who is hurting them. Victims often, they don't want to report this. They don't want to let anyone know because they want to protect their loved one, or maybe if it's between a couple, they fear that their children might be taken away, or maybe if one member has been sponsored by the other, they feel that they might get deported. This makes domestic violence very dangerous because victims are afraid to get the help that they're going to need. So family violence, it can affect all members of the family and extended family, but especially it affects the children. So we want to look at that a little bit further on, and that will be why we are focusing on that in part 2 of our webinar series. Sometimes acts of physical violence or abuse happen once. They're a one-time event. Maybe there's a moment of frustration, a family member acts out violently because of that. One act of violence can lead to other non-physical acts of violence, such as intimidation or emotional abuse, verbal abuse, putting somebody down. And while dealing with stress and frustration, a family member could become abusive over time, over a period of time. However, most acts of domestic violence and abuse, they do follow a pattern, and they will happen again and again until the family is able to get some help. Let's look at what we're talking about when we're focusing more on the assault that happens against women. In most cases, it is men who are committing the violence against women in the household. 7 in 10 people who experience family violence are women or girls. Women are about 4 times as likely as men to be killed by their partner, their spouse, their boyfriend, their husband. For every man who's hospitalized because of family violence, 46 women are hospitalized. So you can see that the majority of victims are women. Domestic violence against women, it robs them of their health, their dignity, and their confidence in themselves, and it takes away their power as an equal member of the family and as an equal member of society. Younger men can also be victims of violence from the older men or the older women who are in the family. So it's not only the women in the family that can be victims, but other family members. Women can also commit violence against other people in the family, maybe against the children or the elders who are in the family. Siblings, brothers and sisters, they can also commit violence, and older teenagers may commit violence against the younger members of the family. Elder abuse and child abuse are also types of domestic violence. Seniors and children are often the most vulnerable members of the family, and we are going to talk about the kind of help that they're going to be able to get if they find themselves in this situation. Intimate partner violence is violence between husbands, wives, or same-sex partners. Even couples that don't live together, they can experience intimate partner violence. So you don't have to be living in the same home in order to be a victim of this kind of abuse. We often talk about intimate partner violence as a type of violence against women. And this is often the most common type of intimate partner violence. However, it's important to remember that women also commit intimate partner violence. Sometimes both partners are engaging in violence, but most of the time it is one partner who is overpowering the other. Intimate partner violence can be physical, it can be sexual, psychological, or financial, just as we listed earlier. There's a cycle to domestic violence, and we've highlighted it here for you. It's quite complicated, especially when it is, between a couple, between family members, but it often takes on a certain pattern. So first, as you see in phase 1, there is some tension that's building between the couple. Maybe the abuser becomes angry and the victim starts to worry about their own behavior. Maybe they become more anxious. Then there is a crisis of some sort. So this is phase 2. The abuser attacks the victim in an act of physical or non-physical violence. After the act of violence, and now you're looking at phase 3, the attacker and the victim both try to figure out, to justify what's happened. And during this justification phase, phase 3, victims may blame themselves. Maybe they're trying to understand the attacker's feelings. The attacker makes excuses. They come up with reasons why they committed a violent act. Maybe they blame the victims or other influences. Maybe they're having financial problems or problems at work, or perhaps alcohol was involved. And so they use those reasons as a justification as to why they acted out violently. And finally, you have the honeymoon phase, which is phase 4. And this is where there is an apology. The victim agrees to give the attacker another chance. And during this honeymoon phase, life is better, life is calm, maybe it's even happy, until the tension starts to build again and we are back to phase 1. So it's important to understand that there is a pattern of violence that can occur. Domestic abuse happens to people of all races, all religions, all sexual orientations, same-sex couples, classes, income levels, education levels. It doesn't matter. Domestic violence can occur to anyone. However, if you are an immigrant or a refugee here in Canada, you may have situations that make you more vulnerable to abuse. So, for example, maybe you don't know what the Canadian laws are all about and what rights you have and what the women's rights are here. Maybe you don't speak English or French very well yet, and therefore you're not able to get the information that you need to find. Maybe you are feeling isolated from others. You don't know too many people. You don't go out of the home too often, so you are feeling isolated. And you don't want to bring shame on your family. No one does. Maybe you are afraid of losing your children because you have heard that sort of thing can happen, which is incorrect. And also, if you have been sponsored by a family member and your spouse is your sponsor, maybe you're even afraid of losing your immigration status. So newcomers who are sponsored by their partners, they may be afraid that if they report the abuse or they report the abuser who happens to be their sponsor, that they could lose their status in Canada. And I want to just make give you some assurances here. If you are sponsored and you are a permanent resident of Canada and you happen to be the victim of abuse by your sponsor, by your abuser, by your spouse perhaps, you will not lose your permanent resident status. You will not. You'll certainly not be deported. You'll not be sent out of Canada for reporting that your sponsor abuses you, or perhaps you've decided you need to leave the relationship altogether. You will not be deported from Canada, and you will certainly not lose your children because you have reported abuse, or perhaps you've decided to leave the relationship. So I want to make sure that you, as newcomers, are confident that you will not lose these certain rights and privileges that you have simply because you have decided you have to report your abuser. Now, we talked about the types of domestic violence that exist. Let's give some examples. Let's get into a little bit more detail. Physical violence, and we'll start with that one. It includes a wide range of acts that are quite easy to identify. The choking, pushing somebody, burning them, restraining them or confining them to a room, locking them up. These are all types of physical violence. And the most extreme of these, of course, is death. And there are occurrences of that in the most extreme situations. The use of physical violence in Canada, that we also call it assault or abuse. It has many forms. It includes acts that cause injury and that you can see, but it also includes injuries that you cannot see, such as confinement or stalking somebody, physical intimidation. Forcing sex on a person without their consent is sexual assault, and this is a type of physical violence. All acts of physical violence are against the law. So we all need to be very clear about that. Sexual violence is any unwanted sexual act. Sexual assault and rape are the most extreme types of sexual violence. Rape includes any type of penetration. Sexual assault includes rape and other forms of unwanted sexual contact. For example, kissing or touching someone without their permission. This is considered sexual assault. Invading a person's privacy, watching them or spying on them without their permission, or taking their picture without their permission. This is another form of sexual intimidation. Exposing your genital area to a person without their consent is considered sexual violence. And most victims of sexual violence are women. However, men can also be victims of this, but in much smaller numbers. Sexual violence can also occur in same-sex partnerships between men and women and women. Everyone has the right to say no to a sexual act or to withhold their consent at any time. This means that people can say no to a sexual act even within the family. Even if sometimes a person can't say no for one reason or another, this does not mean that they are giving consent. Silence is not the same thing as giving consent. Maybe someone is too scared to say no, but this does not mean that they consent to the sexual act. A person who's drunk or unconscious cannot consent either. Neither can children and teenagers who are under the age of 16. Women have the right to control their own bodies, and partners must seek consent for sex every single time. That means forcing a wife or a partner or a girlfriend to have sex without their consent. This is considered to be a sexual assault here in Canada. Psychological abuse, and we often also call this emotional abuse, this is more difficult to see and it's more difficult to understand. It's about exerting power and control over another person. And this type of violence involves using words and actions to hurt or scare somebody, or maybe humiliate them. You threaten them, or you try to put them down, or you hurt them by saying something that they're sensitive about. If you're constantly criticizing or constantly intimidating someone. Psychological abuse can be very traumatic, and it causes anxiety, stress, and depression. This type of violence also includes threats, insults, and constant criticism. Other behaviors or actions that are examples of physical abuse could include, maybe isolating somebody from their other family members or from their friends, or not letting them leave the home, or not letting them make friends. Neglect is also a form of both psychological and physical abuse. It's a failure to provide the basic needs of life, such as food and medical care. All of these forms of abuse are ways of controlling someone and taking away their rights as human beings. And while the effects of psychological violence or abuse may not lead to physical injury or scars, the emotional scars can destroy a person's self-confidence and their self-esteem, and also their ability to function in society. Family members do not have the right to treat each other in this way. Stalking, you may have heard this term. This is an unwanted and an obsessive attention that someone might pay towards another person, and it often causes fear and intimidation. Stalking is considered a type of violence, and it is against the law here in Canada. And finally, let's look at financial abuse. Withholding money or taking away money or valuables from a family member, this is considered abuse. This is of particular concern to women and older women. Forcing a person to work in a family business, for example, for little or for no pay, and still expecting them to carry on all their other family duties, this would be considered abusive. Denying a person the right to work or to go to school to upgrade their skills is also abuse. Making all of the financial decisions without any consideration of the impact of others in the family is abusive. The family member who receives support payments from the government has a lot of power in the family, but all of the adults in this family should have input on how support payments are used, and how they benefit the family as a whole. Maybe if one person is working and the other spouse is not, that doesn't mean that only one person decides how the finances should be spent. Forging somebody's signature on their payments or on anything else, that on the other form of financial reward that they receive, these are against the law. Any financial documents, forging your spouse's signature, this is against the law. In Canada, women have the right to control their own financial resources. Every person has the right to control their own income and their own bank account. To protect your account, you must always keep your personal identification number, which we call a PIN. Keep it secret, even among family members. This is something that only you should know. I mentioned earlier that we were going to talk about elder abuse, so I'm going to cover some of it here. We'll talk about a little bit about the kind of behaviors that cause harm or distress to older persons. Elderly people can be the victims of the same types of physical, emotional, verbal, financial, and sexual abuse as other family members. Neglecting an elderly person in your family or not providing them the proper care is considered elder abuse. Elderly people are often relying on their caregivers, on other family members, and this makes them very vulnerable to some unique forms of abuse. Abusive caregivers, they can withhold food or medicines. They can perhaps force feed somebody. Maybe they give the wrong kind of medicine, or because they are being negligent, or they just don't care whether they're giving the right medication to somebody. Abusers can also use fear or confusion to manipulate elderly people. The elderly are often isolated. They're on their own, and this is a way that abusers can keep control over them. And also to not only control of them, but control of their finances. So elder abuse is something that we should all be very cognizant of, and there is help that we can get for this. Let's look at the consequences. We talked about consequences, and there are many. It's a problem in Canada. Domestic violence is a problem all over the world and also here. All Canadians must do a better job of dealing with domestic violence and of trying to prevent it. The same laws that apply to all of society apply to family members. Assaulting a stranger is the same as assaulting a family member, according to the Criminal Code of Canada. Violence in the home is not considered a family matter. It's considered a legal matter. People in Ontario have the civic responsibility to call the police if they see or hear violence. The police will visit the home. They'll make sure that everybody is safe. They may arrest the person who committed the violence or the act of abuse. And the victims of family violence are encouraged to report their abuse to the police and to seek help from community organizations and services. So when the police do arrive, often family members then don't come forth with what happened, or they remain silent. It's important when the police do come that you share what's happened in the house, in the family, so that the police can then also refer you to get help and refer the abuser to get help also. Domestic violence is more complicated when it's in the family because it involves power, control, and inequality in relationships. Family members, they rely on each other. We rely on our family members, and victims often love their abusers, and they don't want them to be hurt, or they don't want them to be punished. So there are special programs to help family members deal with this problem, and we're going to outline them in just one moment. There are many organizations that help victims of family violence. They're prepared to help the victim and the children leave the home safely if that's what's necessary. And they may also help the family resolve the stress or the conflict that causes the violence in the first place. So where can you get help? Let's look at, there's quite a lot of resources in this community, in all of Canadian communities, where you can get help if you need it. People that experience any kind of violence, they may find it hard to look for help, to seek help, to ask for help. Victims of partner violence, they want to keep their abuse sometimes secret. They feel embarrassed or ashamed, and this is understandable. Maybe they fear for their own safety and that of their children, or their immigration status, as we listed earlier. They may also perhaps depend on their abuser for financial or emotional support. Victims often will blame themselves. Maybe they provoked the abuser, or maybe they fear that other members, other family members, or maybe their ethnic or their religious community will blame them for the problems in the family. So victims could also be afraid of what's going to happen if they seek help and report the violence. They're not sure what's going to happen next. But violence will continue if the victims do not seek help. They cannot fix the problem all by themselves. And the abuser can also seek help to change their behavior. If you or another family member is in immediate danger, do not hesitate to call 911 and explain briefly what the emergency is. If it is not an emergency, you can still call the local police emergency number to indicate that something is going on in the family. If you or a family member needs help, you can call one of these phone numbers: the Assaulted Women's Helpline, the Kids Help phone, this is for children and for teens, the Good to Talk, this is for post-secondary students, high school students, and the Senior Safety Line. You can report suspicions of elder abuse to the police, and the police will check on the person, and they will offer whatever help is available in the community. But be aware that as adults, victims of elder abuse, they also have the right to refuse this kind of help. Reporting elder abuse is not required by law, as it is for the children, unless the victim is living in a senior's residence or a care facility. Victims of elder abuse, they can call the Senior Safety Line for help at 1-866-299-1011. Sexual assault centers, they help victims or survivors of sexual assault. Survivors of recent or historical assault, so an assault that occurred in the past, they can get help. The centers provide confidential counseling. There's no cost to you. The centers, they may have, many of them do have, 24-hour phone crisis counseling. And the centers can also provide survivors and their supporters with important information, such as how to seek medical help, how to report the assault to the police, how to plan for your future safety, and dealing with any memories or flashbacks that have been caused by the trauma. There are sexual assault centers in community across the province, across Ontario. So to find the websites or the phone numbers for the local centers, visit this website, www.sexualassaultsupport.ca/support, or call the Assaulted Women's Helpline at 1-866-863-0511. Many communities also have emergency shelters for women and children who are in danger at home. Women who are in danger or experience domestic violence, they can seek shelter with their children, and these shelters help the women with counseling, planning for their future safety, and to find a new place to live if they've decided to leave the home. Locations of the emergency shelters are kept secret to protect the victims. You must contact an agency or an organization for help, and they will direct you to the shelter. Shelter Safe helps women find a local shelter by listing agencies that run them. So you could go to www.sheltersafe.ca/Ontario, and this is where you can find out where shelters are in your community. Women can also call the Assaulted Women's Helpline for information about emergency shelters. And sometimes families can reduce their violence in the home with counseling and intervention programs. And intervention programs, they help the victims or the survivors with immediate safety, and then they help work towards ending the cycle of violence. We had indicated that there was a cycle of violence, the 4 stages. And so there are intervention programs that can help you and help your family end the cycle of violence. Family members who have experienced any kind of abuse should get counseling. Many community agencies offer intervention programs for men who commit domestic violence, and these programs focus on education, coping with stress, recognizing abusive behavior, and learning how to manage anger and emotions. Most of these intervention programs are mandatory, which means the court has ordered an abusive family member to attend. However, some programs also accept voluntary participants who want to change their behavior and don't want to be the abuser in their families any longer. And violent members who are of the family can also seek counseling. So in conclusion, call 911 if you are in immediate danger. Use the police non-emergency phone number to report violence. You can go to the Children's Aid Society to report child abuse, and call 211 for phone numbers that are in your community of agencies and shelters and other services that you might need. Everyone has the right to report domestic violence and to get help for themselves and for their families. Thank you very much for attending this webinar, Domestic Violence, Part 1.